Okay, so we're looking at Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. There's a few key things that you need to know about the context. Firstly, we need to know that Charge of the Light Brigade was written about the charge of the British Light Brigade in the Crimean War in the Battle of Balaclava. Now what this means is that we're talking about a battle that was 1853, right in the heart of the Victorian era, the expansion of the empire, and in this case the British Army were fighting against Russian forces. Now, looking at this diagram here, you've looked at how the charge actually came about. So what we've got is the British forces at this point. Now the Light Brigade were a group of soldiers on horseback, and what they were armed with were sabres, type of sword. So really for light skirmishes, for speed, going in quickly like a foray, like a sortie, in very quickly and out again, not getting involved in gunfire. Now what we've got here, if you imagine they're going into a valley and the arrows are the Russian cannon positions. So you can imagine huge cannons, heavy gunfire, very little you can do to defend against them. Certainly not if you're on a horse with only a sword to defend yourself. Very little you can do. And the idea was that the British, instead of going into the valley, because the Russians had the higher positions, they would go around the sides and try and involve some of the cannon operators in light skirmishes, kill a few of the Russians and then return back without getting involved in heavy gunfire. But unfortunately, one of the commanders misheard the instruction and actually told the Light Brigade to go into the valley. Now there was nothing they could do. You've got to imagine that the Russians are on a higher position, very difficult to get the horses to go uphill, especially with cannons coming at you. So they're in a very unfortunate, vulnerable position going into the valley. And of course, that's what happened. So it's actually one of the most catastrophic days for the British Army, which up until that point had very rarely been defeated because the British Empire was expanding enormously across the globe. But this was the story of a categorical disaster. A complete catastrophe for the British Army. So the Light Brigade rode into the valley instead of around, which meant that they were really vulnerable for the Russian forces. So you can see the path they should have taken there and the path that they actually took. Now, why did this poem come about and why is it written in the tone it is? What you've got to understand is the role of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, Alfred Lord Tennyson at that time was the Poet Laureate. And the Poet Laureate, which is still a position we have today, it's actually Simon Armitage there, of course, who wrote Remains within the anthology, and previously Carol Ann Duffy, who'd written War Photographer. So poets who are hugely well known and well respected in the country are asked to become the Poet Laureate. Now the Poet Laureate is a royally appointed poet whose role it is to capture the mood of the nation, to write poetry that lasts about significant events, that matches the mood of the people. So the British Army was something that Victorians were enormously proud of, hugely patriotic people, because Britain was seen as ruling the waves, as being the home of the empire on which the sun never sets. So the British Army was a thing of great pride for Britain. So actually, if news started to filter back about this catastrophe, which it had done, that would have meant a lack of trust in the army, perhaps a slight suspicion that all is not well with the British Empire. So Alfred Lord Tennyson was commissioned to write a poem not to reflect on the dismal failure of the Charge of the Light Brigade, but actually to think in another way. So he tried to capture the bravery of soldiers going into their certain death. What was good about them? Well, they were brave. They were noble. They should be honoured. They fought for the British, doing what they were told to do. They obeyed orders, and that was something to celebrate. So the Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson is actually a poem of commemoration, of memory, of glory, and there's very little mention in here of the dismal failure and catastrophe that the charge actually led to. So here's the poem. Half a league, Half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldiers knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, shot at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, came back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. And that final stanza there, you can see that Tennyson is trying to rally this support behind the charge, the glory of these 600 soldiers, many of whom lost their lives in the Battle of Balaclava. But in this particular session, now we've looked at the context and we've read through the poem, we're going to look at the first two stanzas. And our key quote for this particular part is the very first few lines of the poem. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Now remember, these are soldiers on horseback, the Light Brigade. They're quick, they're skillful riders, and that repetition and the rhythm reflects that skill and speed and inevitability. So, half a league. Think about how that pattern is stressed. Half a league, half a league, half a league. It's a stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables. So you get that rhythm of a horse riding, gathering speed, going quickly, bom ba bom, bom ba bom, bom ba bom. And the idea of that gathering speed is what Tennyson is trying to create, that sense of pace at the start of the poem that reflects that charge of the soldiers. So we've got the rhythm of the galloping horses. We've got the repetition, half a league, half a league, half a league onward. The inevitability. I must say that a league is a measure of round about 3 miles. So a half a league, we're talking about 1.5 miles at the time. Imagine how quickly horses can cover that 1.5 miles pretty quickly. And so that gathering pace, that repetition, suggests the inevitability that they're going to go into the battle and not round the outside. It's very difficult once a charge has started to stop a charge of 600 people and turn round. So that gathering pace shows the gathering inevitability of that particular disaster. Now, half a league. Not a league at a time, not that speed. It suggests we've got the gathering speed, but maybe it suggests that there's something not quite right going on. Maybe it foreshadows the sense of doom that's to come. Half a league onward, not a full league. The sense there is given that maybe there's some sort of a mistake. Maybe there's some sort of hesitation before they give the charge. So maybe a gradual and slow progress, though difficult to stop with that rhythm and gathering pace of the horses. So one of those great quotes to start with, where you can get more out of it than just the odd interpretation. Remember, we're always looking for 3 layers of interpretation. One quote, 3 layers of interpretation, like that wet sponge, to squeeze it out and get as much from the quotes as you possibly can. Okay, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death. Now, what a great phrase that is, the valley of death. Think about all that metaphor suggests. So on the one level, it is a biblical allusion. Psalm 23, written by King David, talks about the valley of death, yea, through the valley of death. And what David's talking about there is that God is with him in all of the darkest times. So maybe the use of that biblical allusion, the use of a phrase which is referenced in the Bible, suggests that God was on the British side. That would have gone down very well, of course, with the British public, who, being largely religious, and with Queen Victoria being the head of the Church of England, they would have felt that God was on their side, that it was a crusade that was right for the British Army to do. But as well as being a metaphor and a biblical allusion, the sense of God being on their side, we must also look at the idea, the connotations of death. And that gives the sense of the geographical location, the valley. We've talked about the high positions of the Russian soldiers. But it also talks about, again, inevitability of death. Not all of them died. But many of them did. It was around 2/3 that actually were injured or died during that particular battle. So it suggests the inevitability of the death that they're likely to face. So there's lots again out of that particular phrase that you can go to. So a biblical allusion. All an allusion is something that reflects another story. Something that is taken from a story and used, another text, and used in a different way. So the valley of death here, taking from Psalms in the Bible and used in this particular poem to suggest God being on their side. But also it reflects the geographical location of the valley, but also the inevitability of the death that many of the soldiers suffered. Okay. Now, forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. And we've got some quotes there suggesting the commander who'd given this mistaken instruction to head into the Valley of Death. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. And again, we've got that repetition. They do it straight away. It's inevitable. They obey that command. The command is given, the soldiers ride. And the second stanza reflects that idea of obedience, of compliance to what order they were given, which again reflects the skill and professionalism of the British Army, which is exactly what Tennyson wanted to portray. So in the second stanza, it repeats, forward the Light Brigade. That's the command that was given in the first stanza. Was there a man dismayed? We've got a rhetorical question there. And that rhetorical question just makes us pause and think for a moment. Did the commander, did one of the soldiers for a minute think, this doesn't sound right? And that rhetorical question breaks up the charge a little bit for a moment of reflection, but quickly the pace is rediscovered because we've got this repetition of theirs. And we're told not though a soldier knew someone had blundered, so the soldiers didn't know that there was a mistake made. Instead, this repetition of theirs not to make reply. So it's not their job to reply to these commands, just to do it. Theirs not to reason why. So again, you don't say, why do we do it? You just obey. Theirs but to do and die. And that particular phrase is quite emotive, suggesting that the soldiers' jobs are to die for their country. Now, there's lots of poems that this can compare to, but if you think about comparing this with Exposure by Wilfred Owen would certainly not agree with that idea that it's a soldier's duty, his job, to die for his country. Not at all. But in this case, Tennyson is very much patriotic, very much on behalf of the army, very much praising the soldiers' bravery for going into battle, even though they know their death is likely. And so that repetition of theirs shows that there's a sense of control and obedience. The soldiers are told what to do, they do it. It gives a solemn tone. Theirs but to do and die. That's quite a difficult message, I think, for a public to hear, that somebody's duty is to go out and die. So a solemn tone there, quite serious, quite matter of fact in the sense that their deaths are inevitable. But also, this repetition of theirs suggests that the army are not individual men, but one army, and as an army it is their job to do as they were told. And so at the end of that stanza, into the Valley of Death rode the 600, and we leave it at that point.